During the 2014-2015 New Orleans Triennial, titled Prospect 3 Notes for Now, visitors were met with a curious work of art. Standing at 100 feet tall, a neon sign proclaimed in bright pink, glowing script, "You belong here," as it floated down a 140-foot barge on the Mississippi River. This impressive installation by Bahamian conceptual artist Tavares Strachan is part of a diverse oeuvre. Strachan deals with themes related to visibility and invisibility, the socio-cultural dynamics of scientific knowledge, and political power, among tons of other themes. And the scope of his media is vast, ranging from extracting a 4.5-ton block of ice from the Arctic and shipping it to Nassau, to launching a golden urn with the likeness of the first. This is another picture of, they put it in a big freezer and then exhibited it in Nassau on a really hot day. I think it was the hottest day of the summer. Launching a golden urn with the likeness of the first African-American astronaut into space. Other iterations of his text-based work include the following, and I'll sort of run through some of them. This is called Belong Brooklyn, and it's "You belong here" and "We belong here" on either side of Barclays Center Station in New York, 2011. In Broad Daylight at the Baltimore Museum of Art, 2018. The Encyclopedia of Invisibility at Carnegie International, 2018. And I Belong Here, 2011. This was at the 55th Venice Biennial, just to name a few. Strachan's impressive placement of "You belong here" on the ever-flowing river obviously complicates interpretation, since here is always shifting. I'd like to propose that it is not the unique peripatetic nature of the work that makes context important, but the very nature of the word image that makes context inextricable from meaning making. Many have written about how place shapes interpretation. We've talked about it today. But here I suggest that the semiotic nature of this work heightens context to the level of imperative for interpretation. In this reflection on context as essential for interpretive work in Strachan's Neon Pieces, the paper will consider I Belong Here 2013, installed in the atrium of the Raclin Murphy Museum of Art, where I work, at the University of Notre Dame as a case study. Once I argue for the essentiality of context to the process of meaning making in these text-based works, I'll then argue that this particular work, read only in context, adopts a distinctly Christian interpretive valence, open to then theological interpretation. Okay, let's go back to I Belong Here 2011, which was featured at the Venice Biennial, was Strachan's first instance of employing neon word images. Though many artists employ text in their work, for the purposes of this argument, I'm interested only in works whose sole visual element is the text itself, unaided by any stimuli that might aid in meaning making, such as the inclusion of photographs or drawing alongside text. Unlike later versions and iterations of I Belong Here, this first attempt at I Belong Here is broken apart. Strachan notes in a 2013 interview, quote, "I made the piece because I have long had trouble with that particular word, and that's where the shattering of the phrase came from." Interestingly, after this first neon work, Strachan never again shatters here, gesturing towards a more developed understanding of here as a word that implicitly involves fracture and thereby does not warrant literal fracture, as we see in this first iteration. We also notice that the original I Belong Here 2011 is installed in a closed viewing space within a plain black box. As a kind of nebulous void, the letters both emerge from and disappear into the background, complicating the idea of here again as a fixed, universally understood and experienced concept. As curator and art critic Stamatina Gregory imagines, quote, "And where is here? An artist's studio, a collector's home, an institutional black box, a reproduction in this book or for us in this slide, unquote. In this case, when context is stripped of all visual anchors for locating oneself and the work in place, it nevertheless, and despite the emptiness of the background, informs the construction of meaning. This is in part because the very invocation of the word here necessarily involves movement between conceptual considerations of here and the material context, the literal here of the work. Not only does the inclusion of the word here naturally open up consideration of physical locatedness, but the very nature of the word image relies on context. Art historian Gordon Hughes argues of Jenny Holzer's 1977 truisms that the phrases that she creates have no inherent value. This is Hughes, quote, but are instead free-floating and devoid of ideological articulation, end quote. This emptiness, though, gets converted to potential energy only in relation to the context in which the forms are situated. In short, meaning does not pre-exist on the textual level, but is wrought in conversation with its material surroundings. The primacy of context in works that deal with the interplay between visual and textual signification, though, is not a unanimously assumed position. Some scholars argue that the power of Holzer's work comes not from context, but from the absenting of the artist. So you'll see she doesn't use I. Scholars like David Joslet argue that it is the removal of the artist's self, or as Roland Barthes coins it, the death of the author, in this case demonstrated by the removal of the first person I in Holzer's work that allows the raw power of language to then rise to the surface. Unlike in Holzer's truisms, Strachan noticeably does use the first person. And here I'd like to hold that while context is necessary to interpret Strachan's text-based work as a whole, in my view, it is the very use of the first person that endows these particular pieces with a certain level of uncontextualized power. The rationale here is that one of those manifold interpretations of I, manifold interpretations of who I might refer to, is very naturally and has to be the artist himself, who in this case is a non-white, non-American, non-Western European man. The project of intentionally absenting oneself becomes difficult and increasingly nonsensical for those artists whose ancestors and peoples have already been unwillingly absented from history by the tides of colonialism, racism, sexism, etc. And this insight, I have to say, I owe to Cherise Smith out of the University of Texas at Austin, who gave a wonderful lecture on Carrie Mae Weems recently, so shout out to Cherise Smith. In the ongoing struggle for visibility, the use of I is tantamount to a minoritarian assertion of presence. I'd also like to mention that this work is noticeably wrought in script, which gives the impression of a signature, a universally acknowledged sign of identification. We see this affirmation of selfhood in Strachan's ongoing research project, the Encyclopedia of Invisibility. This years-long work, punctuated by artistic installations, is an effort by Strachan to uncover and celebrate those figures who have been historically left in the dark. Not only is the I an important marker of becoming subject for Strachan, but it is also an identity that can be donned by any reader of the work. The sense of personal relationship with the piece is an intentional choice on the part of the artist. Not only in this maxim, but also in the carefully selected medium of neon, does Strachan attempt to endow ownership of the piece to each viewer. Of neon, Strachan notes, quote, it occupies a similar vernacular to advertising. It takes on the ethos of the people viewing it, and they take ownership of it. And so it's the one way of making an artwork that ends up belonging to the people, end quote. The form of mass media as at once deeply personal, to the general population, as it's owned by everyone and no one at the same time, and also subversive. Viewers expect to see neon only in the context of advertising. And Strachan is not the first to wield the forms of mass media as a means of disruption. Artists like Holzer and Barbara Kruger and Richard Prince, among many, many other conceptual artists, also recognize the subversive power of using forms associated with capitalist consumer culture. And in these instances, the viewer is left with a contradiction between expectation and reception. And the case is the same for Strachan's use of neon. A preferred medium of capitalist consumer culture gets turned on its head. If we again contextualize I Belong Here 2013 within its location at a Catholic university, but this time pay specific attention to the medium, we discover an additional layer of interpretation that in another place or space would be absent, which is the pseudo-religious function of advertising, which, like many religions, promotes ideals, values, moral codes. We see now very clearly, and also many times in the course of history, the pernicious ways that the teachings of certain religions become repackaged, warped, cherry-picked over, and sold to fit the desires of those in power. The historical use of Catholicism as a tool for subjugation and the contemporary use of those same tactics naturally color the lens by which all things associated with Catholicism are judged, the University of Notre Dame and its constituent elements included. This work of art in particular uses the forms of consumerism to spread a paradoxical message of universal belonging at no cost to the viewer. It both spreads a message of belonging through its context, and that context informs its necessity. It asks the viewer, what conditions predicated the possibility of such an artwork in the first place? In a similarly subversive way, it's worth noting that Strachan, in his larger body of work, employs religious subject to shed light on systemic erasure. As part of an exhibition, the exhibition Entangled Past 1768 to Now, Art, Colonialism, and Change at the Royal Academy of Arts in 2024, Strachan exhibited a reimagining of, oops, that's not it, there we go, of Da Vinci's iconic The Last Supper, which he titled The First Supper. This work, rendered in bronze, includes historical figures unrecognized and under-recognized from the annals of history, seated here at a long banquet table. In the same year, 2024, the Blanton Museum of Art exhibited a series of works titled Black Madonna, where heroes from history whose lives were violently quieted are held by their mothers in that familiar Pietà configuration. Though I Belong Here predates both The First Supper and Black Madonna, it fits Strachan's pattern of using a subject or medium to uncover the gap between expectation and reality. In the case of religious imagery, Strachan confronts a history of Christian art in museums and gallery spaces that privileges white bodies. Still, I do not think that the presence of the first person or the medium of neon alone is substantial enough grounds to argue for interpretation of the work as a whole out of context. Simply given that we've already established that the invocation of the word here inevitably makes recourse to the conceptual here and the physical here in which the work is situated, and given Hugh's premise that the words are again, void of ideological meaning at the textual level, that's Hugh's, we must examine material context. We see how evidently important context is to meaning making in words in works like Belong Brooklyn 2021 that get interpreted in the context of political strife and police violence against Black Americans, specifically because of their placement. Let's now shift, and that was a very intentional placement on behalf of Tavares Strachan. Let's now shift our focus to the material context of I Belong Here 2013. When the Raclin Murphy Museum opened just over 2 years ago, the street directly outside the main doors was renamed St. Andre Bessette Way. St. Andre Bessette is the only canonized saint of the Congregation of Holy Cross, the religious order that founded the university in 1842. St. Andre, though, was not the founder of the congregation or the founder of the university, but rather occupied one of the lowliest positions. He was a porter at Notre Dame College in Montreal and had the simple task of greeting people as they entered. Ron was performing St. Andre today at St. Vincent de Paul, helping people in the door. Orphaned at age 12 and with little formal education, he eventually sought admission to Holy Cross and was ordained a religious brother, never a priest, with clerical authority. He noted, quote, "When I joined this community, the superiors showed me the door and I remained 40 years, end quote. For 4 decades, he served the menial role of holding the door for all who came. I Belong Here, 2013, and its placement near the museum doors communes with the legacy of St. Andre. St. Andre Bessette Way is the road that connects the University of Notre Dame's campus to the community. The museum intentionally sits at the edge of campus and in the spirit of St. Andre extends a welcome to all who may happen upon our threshold. The elision with the work of St. Andre and the interpretive power of I Belong Here represents a reading of the work in its relative material historical context. The context endows the work with a social function to challenge historical notions of restricted belonging, but also allows for a theological reading. If we have accepted the necessity of context and we acknowledge Catholicism as part of the context of this image, then the work naturally opens itself up to a theological horizon of inquiry. With this horizon now open, we can imagine a great breadth of possibilities for theological pursuit. But in the final turn of this paper, I'll just begin to suggest a few possible directions. The word image here again, in the context of a Catholic university, takes on the mantle of the word image of Christ, the eternal word who became man in the image and likeness of God, word image. And I've intentionally sort of used that phrase throughout the paper. The logos that became flesh proclaimed in John resonates with the word image, not just in form. This work is literally an image that comes from words, but also in content. The I, the aforementioned first person, now assumes biblical meaning. The I is how God names God's self in Exodus. In John, that I, being itself, unites with human flesh and enters into the world so that all of our eyes resonate with the eternal I. In this framing, I Belong Here is at once a divine insertion into space and time and a personal affirmation reified by the divine one. Who belongs here? God belongs here, and because God belongs here, everyone, all images of God necessarily belong. It's a radical Christian affirmation that declares that in this physical space, God is truly present. It is an affirmation of being inseparable from belonging, for God is belonging, and we as images of God belong. For Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the first House of Hospitality and the movement known as the Catholic Worker, belonging in the body of Christ makes real demands on us. In a Catholic Worker newspaper in January 1936, she wrote, quote, "When we pray with Christ, not to him, we realize Christ as our brother. We think of all men as our brothers then, as members of the mystical body of Christ. We are members one of another. In remembering this, we can never be indifferent to the social miseries and evils of the day. The dogma of the mystical body has tremendous social implications," end quote. It is important to remember that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the person who is your neighbor is untethered to inherent identity. Presumably, the priest or the Levite could also have been a neighbor to the man who was robbed, but instead, as Ron mentioned this morning, identity comes from actions. It's a full circle moment here. In this way, I Belong Here 2013, in this particular context, is both an affirmation of belonging and a call to make it so. It is an affirmation and a challenge to its context. Just as the parable of the Good Samaritan is an invitation to be neighbor and a challenge to the structures and systems that foment unneighborliness. Both the priest and the Levite adhere to the law, but we recognize that it is that very steadfastness to the law that blinds them from the greatest law, to love God, and in doing so, to love thy neighbor. In the context of museums, spaces that were created for the elite and by the elite by means of exploitation and thievery, in spaces that historically occlude people that do not neatly fit into normative categories of race, gender, nationality, etc. This work of art provides a perennial, poignant critique of the very institution in which it rests. Okay, so I've now laid out how these neon works must be taken in context, and only when they are taken in context can we attend to the word image. Once the necessity of context was established, we traced the way in which the particular Catholic context of I Belong Here 2013 opens itself up to not only a socio-historical reading, so that would be St. Andre, Catholicism and colonialism, museums and colonialism, etc., but a theological one that asserts belonging not just as a personal affirmation for visitors, but a divine confirmation. It naturally follows from this study that other text-based installations are potential sites for myriad interdisciplinary and perhaps theological interpretations that stem directly and necessarily from material context. One such example is the Jenny Holzer commissioned pieces carved into the facade of the Raclin Murphy Museum itself, and that's a quote from Agnes Martin and Louise Bourgeois, respectively. But a thorough treatment of this work will have to be for another day. Thank you.